Karetapantes, tut estin hekene diatheke, Greek and English lecture series, Kata Ioanen Triton. Today is the third in our lecture series, continuing on in John's Gospel, looking at the last part of chapter 1, Kephalion to Proton. Te epaurion palin histeki ho Ioannes ke ekton matheton autoduo, ke emblepsas to Jesu perpetunti legi ide ho amnos tu teu, ke ekusan hoi duo mathete autu laluntos ke ekaluthesan to Jesu. Te epaurion, aurion meaning tomorrow, epaurion similar, it's an epirema, an adverb. Te makes this into a noun essentially, and so it nominalizes it, makes it a dative of time, but essentially it's doing the same thing. It's still kind of adverbial. When? On the next day, or on the following day, on the morrow. This is part of the sequence within the first chapters of John, sequencing events, the day, until we have a sequence of 7. Palin histeki. Histeki is pluperfect, hypersuntelikos, and that is marked here by, well, this has reduplication, and also it would be a long iota because it's augmented, and then the ending with a kappa tells me this is in the perfect system, and then the epsilon iota ending is indicative of the pluperfect. And so just as the perfect of histemi, stand, means is standing, the pluperfect in the past means was standing, essentially implying some previous action of standing up. So we have a stative sense of it, was standing. Ho Johannes, John was standing, this is John the Baptist, ke ektomatheton autudo, and of his disciples. So this is a genike, genitive structure. It is a partitive genitive because we're picking out two out of, or two from his disciples who are also standing with him. And when we have a structure like this where we have a named subject and then another subject, often this verb here is singular, agreeing with ho Johannes, rather than plural, referring to the whole group. We see this quite often with Jesus and some of his disciples. Ke emblepsas to Jesu. So here we have the participle metoke. It's aoristos from the sas. The verb is emblepo, similar to blepo, to look at. Emblepo makes it a little bit more intensive, a little bit more directive. Looking at to Jesu, dotike. You can tell that Jesus is dotike because of the article. The form of Jesus in the dotike is the same, Jesu here, as the genitive. Partly governed by emblepsas. Partly governed, I would also say, by the fact that legi also wants to take a dative. But the N part here is what's determining this. He looks at Jesus, peripatunti, walking past. Peripato, very common New Testament verb for walking, very literally walking around, but used in a more general sense for walking. Kai legi says, ide, look, ho amnos tu theo. This harks back to verse 29 that we heard earlier. This is John's standard declaration about who Jesus is. Ho amnos, the Lamb tu theo of God. And the meaning of that partly draws upon a whole range of Old Testament allusions and concepts, and those find their fulfillment within John's Gospel, looking forward to the end of John's Gospel and the crucifixion account. Kai ekusan hoi duo mathetai, and the two disciples, autu, actually I think autu goes with laluntos. I would probably split it here. Hoi duo mathetai, the two disciples. Notice here that the duo sits within the article noun structure. The two disciples, that is the two we already mentioned and defined earlier. Ekusan, straightforward aoristos, from akuo, they heard, takes a genitive complement, autu laluntos. They heard him speaking, that is, they heard John speaking and saying this. Kai ekeluthesan, and they followed. Akolutheo is the verb. Here it's in the aoristos indicative. E for the augment, esan for the ending, to Jesu. Verbs of accompaniment, following, often take a dotike. Straphiste ho Jesus ke theasamenos autus akoluthuntas, legi autois tis etite. Hoide ipen auto, ravi. ho legetai meteromenuomenon, didaskele, pou menis, legi autois erkeste kai obseste. So beginning here, straphis, from the verb strepho, it's a theta eta middle aorist participle. There's no theta in strepho because it changes to estraphe, and so it's just a eta really, but here the participle version doesn't have even an eta, it has ace, and so easy to miss that. And it's middle, it's not really passive because nothing has turned Jesus. Jesus himself has turned around to look. Straphis or Jesus. Jesus turned and theasamenos and saw autos. So both of these are aoristos, because they're prior and complete before the main action legi, which here is in the present tense, enestos chronos. He sees autos, akoluthuntos, he sees them accompanying, following. And here in a very literal sense, he's seeing them following behind him. Presumably they haven't said anything yet. It's Jesus who initiates the conversation. Legi autois, to them, ti zetite, what are you seeking? Zeteo, the verb to seek, to look for. Ti zetitai, what are you looking for? Hoide ipan, auto, they, common to just use the article with a de, switch of subject, hoide, ipan instead of ipon, but still aorist. This formation of an aorist with an alpha for ipon, not uncommon in the third plural. Ravi, ho legetai, this is a parenthetical comment that goes all the way through to here. Ho legetai meteromenuomenon didaskele, which means, translated, that is, which, when it's translated means, or translated it says, it is said, didaskele, teacher. This is a very straightforward way of expressing in Greek the idea of, this word, when it's translated, means this. Rabbi means didaskale. John does this several times throughout his gospel, translating key Hebrew or Aramaic terms for his readers to understand if they don't know those languages. But then he resumes direct speech without any other marker. Pou menis, where are you staying? Meno, stay, remain, wait. Here it's staying in the sense of where is he staying. Legi autois, notice that there's no hod there here, no switch of subject, but it is Jesus. He says to them, erkeste kai obseste. Don't be tricked by these endings. The first erkeste is a command, prostaktike, come, and it's enestos chronos, it's a progressive or an imperfective command. Come, almost like start following, start coming after me. Kai obseste est in ho melon chronos. This is a future tense form from horao, to see, has the stem op, and so in the future ops because of the sigma, and you will see, you'll find out, you'll see exactly where I'm staying. Elthan un kai iden pumeni, kai paravtu emenen ten hemera nikinen, hora en hostekate, en Andreas ho delphos Simonos Petru, his ektonduo ton accusanton para Ioannu, kai acoluthesanton auto. Apologize for the variations in my own pronunciation scheme. Elthan, spelling variation for Elthon, and Edan, spelling variation for Edon, both with this alpha, and so you can see that this is a feature both of Koine more broadly, but I think it's particularly prevalent within John's Gospel to use an as a third person plural ending for asigmatic aorists. But the meaning is the same. They came then and they saw, pou many, relative here, pou, or kind of indirect discourse, they saw where he was staying. Notice this is present tense though, where he is staying, but because this is already past, you can understand this as past. Ke parauto, and with him, para with a dotike, proximity, particularly with a person, presence, co-location, emenan, they stayed with him, ten hemeran ekinen, the whole, well, that day, that is throughout the course of that day. The aitiatike, accusative, expressing extent or duration through time. We then get a kind of background statement, hora en hos decate, and both this and this and in general is providing often, not always, often is providing background information. And so that's what it is doing here. Hora en, the hour, even though there's no article there, the hour or the time, the hora, was hos as, this is making it a little bit approximate, decate, the 10th hour. Keeping in mind that the standard numbering of hours at that time is from the first hour at dawn through the day till the 12th hour, the last hour before evening. So the 10th hour is in the afternoon, around 4 p.m. The second thing to say is that an hour is actually the span of time, not a point of time. So it's not like 4 p.m. It's the hour or the span of time around the 10th hour. And Andreas, so again, background information was, and fronted here, it's brought to the front, Andreas was, and yet Andreas is first described before we get what he was. So this is a segment. Andreas, ho adelphos Simonos Petru, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, was, heis, one, and then we get one, and then we get this X statement, out of, and then we have a genitive string, essentially, ton, akosanton, paraiokoluthe doing the same job as before that the bare genitive can do. That is, it's out of this group. One of the two ton akusanton, the two that heard, aorist participle, para Ioannou, from John, that is, they heard John say, ide ho amnos to theu, kai ekoluthe santon, and the two that accompanied autor, Jesus. So those two disciples, who have really been quite tightly defined, the two that heard John say those words, the two that followed Jesus, and the two that stayed with him, one of them was Andreas ho adelphos Simonos Petru. Heuriski hutos proton ton adelphon ton idion Simona, kai legi autor, heurekamen ton Messian, ho estin meterimiuomenon Christos. Ega gen auton proston Iesun. Emblepsas autor ho Iesus ipen, sui Simon ho huios Ioannou, su kletheisei Kephas, ho hermenuete Petros. Heuriski hutos. This one, and so why hutos? Because we're referring to the one we just identified, that is Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter. He, heuriski, finds, enestoskros, present tense, he finds proton firstly. Proton, some manuscripts have protos, which essentially has the same effect. Often the adjective form applies in a way that matches the adverbial version, proton. But the emphasis here is really that the first thing he does is he finds ton adelphon ton idion his own, a little bit more emphatic than ton adelphon autou, his brother, ton idion his very own, his own brother, Simona, Simon, kai legi autor, and says to him. And so notice the way that John constructs this information. In the previous verse, we're told that Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, implying that the reader probably knows and has heard of Simon Peter, even though he's introduced second in the narrative because it's Andrew who goes to find Simon Peter. So there's some presumed knowledge when Gospels are written in terms of what the reader might understand. They're more likely to know who Simon Peter is, and so that's why Andrew is introduced as Simon Peter's brother, and yet then Andrew goes to find Simon, and in a moment he's going to be called Peter. Heurekamen ton Messian. Heurekamen is parakimenos, perfect chronos, perfect time, or tense form. A couple of things help us here. Firstly, there's a kappa, that this ending is telling me that this is perfect. Secondly, we do not have augment because why? Because we're not in the past. We don't have a reduplication though, or at least we don't have reduplication that we can see here. There's no marked reduplication because of the way Hugh works. Sometimes you might find an eta used to do reduplication via augmentation. Why is it perfect? I think the sense here is the result, and so it's the present importance. We have found ton Messian, the Messiah. Secondly, the thing to say is Messiah is not commonly transliterated in the New Testament, and immediately John clarifies what he means by giving another parenthetical statement, ho estin methermeneuvomonon, such a mouthful to say, even for me, which is translated Christos. Here's the term that most of his readers and speakers would understand, Christos. Again, he led, talking about Andrew. Andrew led him, that's Simon, auton proston Ieson, to Jesus. Emblepsas auto, so same verb, emblepsas, aeristos, metoche. Here it's the subject is ho Jesus. Jesus looked intently or stared at him and said, Sui Simon, you are Simon, hokios Ioannou, the son of John. Normally when you use a pronoun, it's a little bit emphatic. It's probably not very emphatic here in the structure you are. I think it's just fronted for emphasis, but not strong kind of emphasis. Suklethese, here we have the future middle or middle passive of kaleo, to call. You will be called. Klethese, built off the theta eta, similar to the aorist theta eta middle. So I will call this a future theta eta middle. You will be called Kephas. Ho hermenevete Petros. Again, I don't think this is Jesus talking. I think this is John giving a parenthetical comment, which is translated Petros. So now we've seen three different versions of parenthetical comments explaining an Hebrew or Aramaic term, each slightly different. They're not formulaic, but here Kephas is not common in the Gospels. Paul does use this, but generally we just have Petros. Te epaurion etelesen exelthin isten Galilean kai heuriski Philippon kai legi auto ho Jesus akolutei moi. Ende ho Philippos apo Bethsaida ectes poleos Andreu kai Petru. So another time marker, te epaurion, the next day, the following day. Again, epaurion not used as an adverb, but nominalized with the article to arthron, on the next day, the next day. Ethelesen exelthin, he wanted, from the verb thelo or ethelo, aoristos from the sigma, he wanted exelthin to go out, completing, and people would say a complementary infinitive, completing the idea of thelo. What did he want? He wanted to go out, exelthin, eastern Galilean, into Galilee. Kai hevriski, and so now we've shifted to the enestos chronos. We're back in a historical present, and he finds Philippon, Philip, kai legi auto ho Jesus, and he says to him, Jesus says to him, notice that Jesus is held back to the end of this sentence. He's not really, I mean, you could mention Jesus at the start of this sentence, but the main driver of our narrative at this point is Jesus. And really, I think it's mentioned here because it's functioning with this subunit, kai ho Jesus legi auto, instead of earlier. And then we get direct speech, akolute. This is a prostactike. It is an imperative. It is present. You can tell from the way the ending is, from the akoluteo, and there's a little bit of contraction that's taken place. Follow me. En deho Philippos. So again, we get this kind of background information with en, almost like now Philip was. Here's some information about Philip. Apo Bethsaida, he was from Bethsaida. Ectes poleos, from the city. Andreu kai Petru, from the city or the town of Andrew and Peter. So we're giving some identifying information about who Philip is to contextualize him, given that we've already met Andrew and Peter. Who on earth is Philip? Why did Jesus go out and find him and call him? There's some pre-existing relationships here that explain the context of what's happening. Heuriski Philippos ton Nathanael. kai legi auto hon egrapsen Moses into nomo kai hoi prophetai heurekamen Iesun huion tu Yosef ton apo Nazaret. Kai ipen auto Nathanael ek Nazaret dunatai tiagaton inai legi auto Philippos erku kai ide. Heuriski Philippos. Philip finds, again, there's no connecting conjunction here. This is called a syndeton. We're straight into the next thing. Philip finds Nathanael, and there's a bit of variation with articles and names in Greek in general. When you're finding Hebrew names, such as Nathanael, often the article is used because the article can tell you the case where there's no ending changes here. It's indeclinable. And so only an article can tell you what case it is. Is that strictly necessary here? Perhaps not, because it's clear from the ending of Philippos that this is the subject. But nonetheless, it certainly makes it a little bit easier. Secondly, so with a name, you cannot assume that the presence or absence of an article tells you whether an entity is known or not. For example, down here, there's no article for Moses. Does there need to be one? Probably not. But in standard Greek, would you expect one? Probably. Philip finds Nathanael kai legi auto and says to him, hon egrapsen, whom wrote. To us, that seems like a strange construction. People call this a headless relative clause. That is, there's nothing here that the hon refers back to. In fact, what the hon refers back to comes later. The one whom is how you might get around that in translation. The one whom Moses wrote or wrote about, in to nomo, in the Torah, in the law, kai hoi prophetai. So again, hoi prophetai is a second subject for this verb egrapsen, but this verb is singular. Moses wrote in the law, and the prophets, they also wrote. This is quite common to make the verb agree with the first singular subject. And so that's not itself confusing. Sometimes it lays emphasis. The emphasis here is on Moses, and the prophets then as a collective kind of back up that. That's probably how I would take it here. Hon then finds its verb, heurekamen, we have found. The one whom Moses found, we have found him. And then we get this kind of appositional statement, also in accusative, filling out hon and the him here. We have found him, Iesun, Jesus, huion, the son, to Yosef, the son of Joseph. Again, Joseph indeclinable, to establishes the relationship for us, the son of Joseph. Ton, taking us back to here, is accusative and giving us another thing in apposition, another thing describing Jesus, the one, apo Nazaret, from Nazareth. Kai ipen avto Nathanael, Nathan says to him, this line here should be back over here. Oh no, sorry, this line here should be back over here. Let me clarify. Ek Nazaret dunatai ti agathon, from Nazareth, ti agathon, or agathon ti, either way, something good, any good thing, dunatai inai, is or can, dunatai, possibility. Can any good thing be from Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? For Nathanael, this is a kind of a laughable or absurd statement. Nothing good can come. It's a rhetorical question in that sense. Legi auto Philippos, Philip responds to him, says to him, erku kai ide. Erku, again, prostactike, command, here it's singular instead of erkeste, erku, come. And it's interesting that the enestos is used rather than the aoristos, elthe, implying a kind of progressive action. Come and keep coming, kai ide, and see. Iden ho Jesus ton Nathanael erkomenon pros auton kai legi peri autu, ide alethos Israelites in ho dolos ukestin. Legi auto Nathanael, poten me ginoskis. Iden ho Jesus saw ton Nathanael, Nathanael, erkomenon. The erkomenon here is in a predicate position, that is, it's not governed by the article. It is not entirely circumstantial, though. It's what people might call a double accusative complementary accusative, which is a mouthful, because what it's saying is not simply that Jesus sees Nathanael as he happens to be coming, but he sees Nathanael and he sees the fact that Nathanael is coming. So that's the idea of the double. He sees Nathanael coming. The two things are the object of perception. Prosauton, towards him, kai legi peri auto, and says about him or concerning him. And so even though Nathanael does respond, the statement is made about Nathanael as much as to Nathanael. Ide, see. But because the statement is not made to Nathanael, the ide is made as a general comment of, look, here is, pay attention, behold, voila, almost like an idu as well. It's a statement about Nathanael, and so it's not strictly singular imperative, it's an attention drawing device. Secondly, alethos is technically epirema, adverb, but again, it's kind of adjectival here, functioning with Israelites, an Israelite. Truly an Israelite, a true Israelite. A bit of overlap between those expressions. Here, really, truly, there is an Israelite. In whom, dolos ukestin, dolos fronted here for emphasis, deceit, in whom there is no deceit. Legi auto Nathanael says to him, pothen me ginoskis, from where, whence, do you know me? Do you recognize me? Apekrithe Jesus kai ipen auto, protus se Philippon phonesai onta hypoton suken, idonse. Apekrithe auto Nathanael, ravi, sui hohuios tu teu, su vasolis e tu Israel. Vasilius e vasileds. Apekrithe, this is thede the middle of apokrinomai, to answer, to respond, to reply. And it is typical, very typically thede the middle for this verb. Apekrithe, almost a fossilized form. Jesus answered or responded, kai ipen auto, and said to him. The second thing here is the doubling up of speech verbs, even when they are not necessarily adding very much. Jesus answered and said. How does this differ from apekrithe auto Nathanael? Nathanael answered him. It doesn't vary that much in terms of what it means to us. Certainly it's difficult to translate into English. We don't like to double up verbs that overlap quite like this, but it's common in Greek usage and especially in New Testament usage. Apekrithe, particularly, is not always an answer. Sometimes it's a response. And so keep that in mind when Jesus responds to people without answering their questions. Pro tu phonesai, pro with the article and then the infinitive, aperemphatos, is a temporal structure before this action. And so the action is phonesai, call, the action of calling, phoneo. The subject and the object of the infinitive are both accusative. Before Philippon, before Philip called you. This, I would say, is an unusual syntax ordering of the subject and the object of an infinitive. It's much more common to find the subject in the first position and then the object in a second position. The context that we know Philip called Nathanael makes clear what's going on here. Without that, if I came across this sentence in the wild, without any context, I would probably assume that se was the subject, Philippon was the object. And so that, I would say, is a slightly unusual feature here. But the emphasis on se is partly explained by the fact that it's all about se, right? Protu se Philippon phonesai, before Philip called you, onta, you being hypoten suken, under the fig tree, idon se, I saw you. I saw you. So I would really connect this se to onta rather than necessarily taking this onta back to this se. The se is, I think, partly repeated to clarify what Jesus is saying. I saw you under the fig tree. I saw the fact that, this is another one of these double accusative complement structures. I saw that you were under the fig tree. Apekrithe auto Nathaniel. Nathaniel responds to Jesus. Ravi, again, Ravi, didaskale, sui hohuios to Theu, su vasalevs I to Israel. You are the Son of God, you King are of Israel. Theologically, this is incredibly interesting that right here in chapter 1 of John's Gospel, we have a straight out declaration that Jesus is the Son of God and King of Israel. Second thing to say is that most often within the Gospels, the phrase the Son of God refers to divine kingship rather than divine sonship in a theological sense. That said, when the phrase the Son is used without to Theou, particularly within John's Gospel, it's often talking about the Father-Son relationship, which is about divine sonship. But I just highlight this in terms of the Christology of the Gospels. Hohuios to Theou is often a claim to be a king like King David. That is, it's a claim to divine kingship of Israel, which is why here I think these are put in parallel. The second thing to observe is grammatically, sui hohuios, but then su vasalevs I, you are the king to Israel. There's no article here, and this is one of the verses that influenced Colwell in his formulation of Colwell's construction or Colwell's rule about the presence of an article with a in a predicate complement structure, like back in verse 1. And so it's reasonable and not necessary, but very likely that you should understand this as you are the king of Israel, not you are a king of Israel. Apekrithe Jesus ke ipen auto, hoti ipon soi, hoti idonse hypokato te sukes, pisteuis, mis do tuton opsei. Again, apekrithe Jesus ke ipen, Jesus responded and said to him, hoti ipon soi, because I said to you that, this explains the double hoti structure here, right? Because I said to you that, idon said that I saw you, hypokato. Both of these, hypo and kato, both mean under in the right context. Hypo and kato, they are often in the New Testament and to some extent in the LXX, often compounded as a single preposition, hypokato, methetes genikes, with a genitive, under. Under tes sukes, under the fig tree. Because I saw you, well, because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, pisteuis, you believe, question. How do you know this is a question? Only really context and the tradition of punctuation. It could be a statement, pisteuis, full stop. But the instincts of punctuation adders in the manuscript tradition is often very reliable, and the fact that Greek does not need you to have a question word suggests that you should generally trust when questions are put like this. Mes do tuton opsei. This little phrase probably worth working backwards here. Opsei, future of horao, second person, middle. In the future, horao is middle only. Opsomai. So opsei, you will see. You will see metzdo. This should be understood to be similar to metzdona. That is, it's accusative plural. It is greater things. And then tuton, comparative, sum kritikon, greater things than these, than the thing, if this convinced you, hold on to your hat. Kai legi auto, amen lego humin, obseste ton uranon aniogota, kai tus angelus tu theu anabanontas kai katabanontas epiton huion tu anthropu. So many interesting things are packed into this last verse of the chapter. Firstly, the very fact that it starts here with kai legi auto, Jesus was just speaking and the speech is interrupted with and he says to him, and the fact that it's a present or a historical present is emphasizing the solemnity or the seriousness of this declaration. The second thing that backs this up is the presence of Amen, Amen. Only the fourth gospel really uses double amens, and again it's emphasizing the solemnity of Jesus' declaration. Truly, truly, I say to you. Notice here that we shifted from a direct conversation with Nathanael to a more general speech to Humin, to those present, presumably at least Philip and Nathanael, possibly also Simon Peter and Andrew, possibly others. Obses there, you will see. So back to the second person plural of future. You will see ton uranon, the heaven, that is the... Well, there's an overlap between the sense of uranos as heaven and sky, and it's worth holding those two in tension. You will see, I would probably say heaven with a big capital H in English. Aniogota. Aniogota is a perfect participle, parakimenos, from anoigo, to open. And here it's, again, this is a double accusative object complement. You will see heaven opened. And this is perfect, parakimenos, because it's the state of being opened. We're not interested in how it got opened, just in the fact that it kind of stands open. What else will they see? Tous angelus tou theou, the angels of God. Anabainontas, ascending, going up, ainabaino. Kai katabainontes, going down. Epi ton huion tou anthropo, upon the Son of Man. The Son of Man, again, is an important phrase within the Gospels, within the Gospel traditions, connecting both with the way that Jesus talks about himself, almost always, not always, but almost always found on the lips of Jesus himself as a self-descriptor, the Son of Man. And a play on words connecting both with imagery from Daniel, but also the sense that Jesus he's a man, he's a human being. He's the paradigmatic human being, and yet the apocalyptic figure from Daniel and from other sources. That's it for this chapter, the whole of chapter 1 done now. Hopefully you found this helpful. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions, any thoughts, and I'll move on to chapter 2 in the next lecture. Eros there.